Hello and welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen TV. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what we believe, that every word has the right to be free. And I'm going to be speaking lots of free words this evening. And so, I hope, are my studio audience here in Beirut. They're my words. They're free. Nobody bought them. Nobody can sell them. No one can force me to say them. But they're my words. They're not the words of Al Mayadeen TV. So if there's any mistakes in them, blame me. We're talking this evening with the memory of the July-August war between Israel and the Lebanese people, the Lebanese national resistance, very fresh in our minds. And it's about a subject, a thorny subject, a kind of moral maze in which it's easy to get lost. It's easy to take false turnings, and it's easy for the picture to be distorted and misrepresented. Because tonight we're going to be talking about the ethics and the efficacy of taking prisoners, of prisoner exchanges, of the whole complex question of hostage taking as it's routinely described in the West. Now, of course, there's a great deal of hypocrisy involved here, a great deal of double standards. Israel's dungeons, for example, are filled with Palestinian prisoners who might or might not have been in front of a court, but they are hostages nonetheless, because they were subjected to kangaroo courts based on military tribunals, based on a series of premises which are not accepted either by the belligerents or by the international community. If Israel arrests a parliamentarian, for example, because he's an MP for a party they don't like, what is he but a hostage? But of course, states have the ability to dress up their hostage taking as due process of law. Me, I'm, as a revolutionary person, clear that there is a long revolutionary history about taking prisoner people from the enemy forces, from the occupying forces, the invading forces, and exchanging them for comrades, partisans who have been taken by those occupation, by those invading forces. I see nothing per se immoral in that. But I have two lines that I have to lay out to you because I have to be frank and honest. Because it's not just the big international audience of Al Mayadeen TV that's watching this evening. The enemy is also watching. I'm clear that the killing of prisoners is morally repugnant and unaccepted. It is not possible to justify the killing of unarmed, captive, helpless people. Neither is it morally justified in any circumstances to torture or otherwise mistreat a prisoner. Now, the exigencies of a revolutionary organization in asymmetric warfare often mean that some things like prison visitation rights, for example, for prisoners taken by a revolutionary group or force, are not possible. To that extent, there is an element of mistreatment, which is inescapable, ineluctable, and is, by definition, within the situation that we are talking about here. But, for example, in Iraq, for a time, Western workers, aid workers even, were being taken prisoner, were being held hostage, and when ransom negotiations failed or went nowhere, the hostages were cruelly murdered, and some of them were my own compatriots. Now, don't get me wrong. I warned at the time that nobody should go to occupied Iraq. As I say, nobody should go to occupied Afghanistan today. Nobody should be working in the occupation of these countries. But you cannot justify the cruel murder of civilian people who have been taken and are helpless within your grasp. These are my two principles. Now, a lot of my best friends are people who were released in prisoner exchanges. I've received people at Heathrow Airport and in the British Parliament, freshly released from 99-year prison sentences, cruelly imposed by kangaroo courts in Israel, for doing no other than is lawfully necessary and permitted under international law, namely the right to bear arms against the illegal occupation of your country. But they would still be serving their 99 years if it had not been for the taking of other prisoners and the exchanging of those prisoners for my friends. So I'm not going to be a hypocrite in this. We have, in the usual expertise of my studio audiences, many people here today, with first-hand knowledge and some with indirect knowledge of exactly these kind of dilemmas. So I'm asking here tonight, on Kalima Horra, is it right, is it moral to take prisoners in the battlefield or even surreptitiously by crossing a border, for example, seizing a prisoner, taking them back and holding them in exchange for imprisoned comrades on the other side of the wire? What are the obligations of the captor in these circumstances? What are the moral principles that should underlie the whole affair? And is it ever justified to kill or mistreat those who have been taken hostage in those situations? It's a moral maze, I told you, and many people will be watching this program to see how we find our way through that moral maze. But I have every confidence in my studio audience here in Beirut that they can do that. So let me throw to the audience for the first question. We try to get as many people in on these debates as possible. Who'd like to contribute first on this subject? Who's got the microphone? Yes, sir.
حسين حزوري، كلية الإعلام والتوثيق، الجامعة اللبنانية. من الواضح أن الغرب أنه عند أسر أي جندي إسرائيلي الغرب يقف إلى جانب إسرائيل وينتفض ويستنفر كل مؤسساته الدبلوماسية والعسكرية من أجل دعم فاضح وكبير للكيان الصهيوني. لكن في المقابل في فلسطين المحتلة هناك ربما يوميا أسر لفلسطينيين، وهناك عشرات الآلاف الفلسطينيين الذين يقبعون في سجون العدو الصهيوني. هذا التناقض وهذا الازدواج في المعايير ما سر الانحياز الكبير للغرب تجاه الكيان الصهيوني على حساب فلسطين المحتلة؟ كيف يمكن أن نفسر ذلك؟ وأيضا هل ربما الدول الغربية أو بعض الدول الغربية تخاف من إسرائيل ربما قادرة على تغيير معادلات سياسية في تلك البلدان؟ هذا سؤالي الأول. أما الثاني، المقاومة في لبنان قدمت شهداء من أجل تحرير الوطن وقامت بتحرير أسرى من أجل مبادلة الأسرى بالأسرى والدفاع عن الأرض، ليس من أجل الهجوم، فقط من أجل الدفاع والمبادلة. سؤالي هنا، لماذا هذه أيضا ازدواجية هنا في المعايير؟ لماذا الدول الغربية تصنف المقاومة على أنها إرهابا؟ هل هذه الأعمال أعمال الدفاع عن الوطن هل باتت اليوم أصبحت إرهابا؟ هل هذه الأعمال السامية باتت إرهابا؟ أيضا سؤالي مباشر موجه لحضراتكم، أنتم كلنا نعرف أنك من الجنسية البريطانية وتدعمون المقاومة، تقومون بحركات ونشاطات من أجل المقاومة. ما الذي يدفعكم إلى ذلك في حين أن حكومة بلدكم البريطانية تصنف هذه الحركات على أنها إرهاب؟ شكرا.
Well, I'm often asked when I go to the United States in particular. I have a weekly radio show in the United States in New York, and I travel through American airports a lot. And every time I'm asked the same questions by policemen in the same uniforms, but in different places. But the questions are always the same. And they ask, do you consider X organization, no prizes for guessing which one they normally mention, is a terrorist organization? I say no. I regard that organization as a freedom-fighting organization which has sometimes committed terrorist acts, just like the African National Congress, led by Nelson Mandela, who is everybody's hero, everybody's icon, although, of course, when he was only our icon and we were trying to free him from 27 years in the dungeons of apartheid, Mrs. Thatcher, I personally saw and heard her, I saw her lips moving 10 yards from me, describing Nelson Mandela as a terrorist. I heard her saying it in the British Parliament. But now he's everybody's icon. The African National Congress was a freedom-fighting organization which did commit some acts of terrorism. That does not make them a terrorist organization. It makes them exactly as I've described them, a group of freedom fighters who have committed some acts of terrorism. Now, the great European Jewish intellectual Peter Ustinov had a very useful definition in this regard. He said that war is the terrorism of the rich and powerful, and terrorism is the war of the poor and powerless. And as I said in a previous show here on Al Mayadeen TV, it's like the encounter between Alexander the Great and the pirate captain on the high seas. Alexander demands from the pirate, "How dare you terrorize these waters as a thief?" And the pirate answers, "How dare you terrorize the whole world? You, with your great navy, can call yourself an emperor and can call other men as you please. You are a pirate, you are a terrorist, you are a rogue, you are a failed state, you are this, you are that." That's the double standard that we have in this regard. Now, how do we define terrorism? For me, terrorism is the hurting of innocent people to punish the guilty people. For example, the blowing up of underground trains in my constituency in London in 2005 was an act of terrorism. It was totally indiscriminate, hurting, maiming, and killing very large numbers of people. People who you could not conceivably know their role in society. In fact, given London's political character, almost all of the people who were hurt on those trains, especially as the rich and powerful don't travel on the underground trains, would be people who were marching with me against the war in Iraq. People who were marching with me for justice for Palestine, for example. This is pure terrorism. This is nihilistic destruction of human life for political purposes. That's terrorism. But it's also terrorism when it's carried out by a man in a suit in the White House or in Whitehall, when he kills Iraqis for political purposes, irrespective of who those Iraqis are. And how could he possibly know who these Iraqis are? We're going to continue this discussion, following on from that very important question, when we come back right after this break. Welcome back to Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen TV with me, George Galloway. Tonight we're discussing the vexatious question of prisoner taking, hostage taking, prisoner exchanges, and ineluctably we've slipped into a definition of terrorism because, of course, that's the frame, the paradigm in which this issue is ordinarily discussed in the West, at least, where they have a very peculiar view of what is terrorism and what is legitimate war. But I was explaining before the break my view to a young gentleman here who raised some very important questions, one of which was the definition of terrorism. I've given you mine. I'll be hearing, I'm sure, from the studio audience of theirs. But he asked a second important question. And here, if you'll forgive me, I want to refer to my most famous video on YouTube in 2006 during the Lebanon War with Sky News, one of Rupert Murdoch's finest. It was a 9-minute interview that's now got 50 million views on YouTube in 5 different languages. It turned on this question of how come when an Israeli soldier is kidnapped or captured or taken on the battlefield or in other circumstances, the entire world very quickly knows his name, his rank, his address, and has interviewed his sister, his wife, and his grieving parents, and over again. Whilst nobody knows the names in the West, nobody knows the names of any of the thousands of Palestinian prisoners and the many Lebanese prisoners who were held captive here in Lebanon or taken across the fence to occupied Palestine, and who were routinely tortured and who had no due process of law of any kind. But nobody knows who they are. Nobody ever interviews their sister or is interested remotely in how their parents are coping with the kidnap of their son. And the reason, I'm sorry to say, as I said in my last show on a different subject on Jerusalem, in the West, the blood of some people is more valuable than the blood of others. The liberty, therefore, of some people is more important than the liberty of others. And Muslim blood is cheap. Arab blood is cheap, partly because we don't demand a higher price for it. But that's another subject that I've dealt with before and no doubt will again. So that's the reason, my friend, they don't regard a Lebanese prisoner or a Palestinian prisoner as anything like as important as an Israeli prisoner. The ratio, if you want to balance it, 100 to 1, maybe 1,000 to 1. There'd have to be 1,000 Palestinian or Lebanese prisoners to get the kind of attention that one Israeli prisoner will get. And now that I say that, maybe not even there in the context of 1,000. Thanks for the opportunity to say that. Let's go to the next guest. Yes, gentlemen.
بسام نصر الله من التيار الوطني الحر. أنا عندي أكثر تعقيب على اللي تفضلت فيه حضرتك بالبداية مستر جورج، اللي هو أحقية الأسر عند المجموعات. يعني بالأساس عند الجيوش ممكن يكون في اتفاقيات دولية بتحكم بيع السلاح، أي سلاح يستعمل، أي سلاح محظور إنه يستعمل، وعمليات الأسر في اتفاقيات دولية بتحكمها. إنما عند المجموعات المقاومة يلي هي مجموعات غير منظمة مش معروفة أماكنها وين، بتشتغل بطريقة سرية لحتى ينجح عملها. كل الضوابط الموجودة عند الجيوش واللي أصلاً عند الجيوش بالحروب بتختفي، بتضمحل، مش بتختفي، بتضمحل لأنه الحرب بتفرض حالها. فعند المجموعات المقاومة بيتحكم بكل هالعمليات هيدي، عمليات الأسر وكل الاشياء اللي موجود فيها اتفاقيات دولية بيتحكم فيها ثقافة المجموعة. هيدي المجموعة بحياتها كيف بتعيش، تراكم طرق العيش عندها والآليات يلي بتشتغل فيها هيدي المجموعة. وبالتالي هون بطلنا عم ندخل بأحقية، هون المجموعة إلها حق تعمل يلي بدها إياه. بس الخطورة بالموضوع إمتى حضرتك بتعتبر هيدي المجموعة أصبحت إرهابية؟ يعني إمتى تتحول مجموعة بالفعل هي مقاومة إلى مجموعة إرهابية؟ شكرا.
Well, a very important set of questions there, some of which have got me thinking along some parallel lines. I was expelled from the Labour Party by Mr. Tony Blair in 2003 on 5 charges, one of which was that I called on the British Army in occupied Iraq to refuse to obey illegal orders. Now, I never understood what was wrong with that, because actually it is a legal obligation on all soldiers to disobey illegal orders. I saw it was a totally illogical charge. If any British soldier did obey an illegal order, he himself would be committing a crime under international law as defined at the Nuremberg tribunals at the end of the Second World War. And you're right, sir, there are protocols of war, there are conventions, Geneva Conventions, laws of war, and so on. And the American army in Iraq was subject to all of these conventions and all of these laws. But that didn't stop them dragging around on chains like dogs Iraqi prisoners in Abu Ghraib, stripping off their clothes, piling them on top of each other, forcing them to commit indecent acts upon each other, videotaping all of it for the entertainment of the soldiers in the barracks afterwards. So in the end, these conventions and laws do not in themselves mean anything, and they did not mean anything as recently as the past decade in the invasion and occupation of Iraq. It's true that armed groups, guerrilla groups, asymmetrical, unconventional, here today, gone tomorrow, ununiformed, without rank maybe, that these groups are not subject to these same laws and rules. But I'm arguing here that these groups have a higher obligation than the armies of these states, not least because we know that the armies of these states do not obey these laws anyway. But we are all subject to the law of God. We are all subject to our conscience. We are all subject, even if the fighter concerned is an unbeliever. They presumably have a moral code, or they wouldn't be in this fight in the first place. And they have an obligation to conduct their operations, including their operations involving prisoner taking, according to those laws, to those moral standards, to this conscience, especially as many actually in this part of the world of these armed groups are calling themselves soldiers of God of one kind or another. So you can't be a soldier of God and then cut somebody's throat who is a prisoner in your hands because you were unable to negotiate a deal. This is a sin. This is a crime, but it's also a sin. And if you believe, as I do, that there is a judgment day, you will answer for that sin, for that crime on a later occasion. So I myself do not make a dichotomy between the responsibilities upon irregular fighters and regular soldiers, not least because all of my experience from Abu Ghraib and many other examples in Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan involving my own country's armed forces as well as the armed forces of the United States and other occupiers of Iraq and Afghanistan. You can pile the statutes, the laws from here to this roof, but if they're not being implemented by the soldiers on the ground and the officers in charge of them are not interested in them, then it won't make a blind bit of difference. But I say that the underdog soldier in the night, as Bob Dylan described it, the irregular fighter who's fighting for a moral cause, he has more of an obligation to behave in a moral way towards prisoners and towards hostages, as the West would describe them. Now, who's got the microphone? Who's next?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
علي سرور أسير محرر من السجون الإسرائيلية. بالسجون حقيقة يعني نحن كلبنانيين مشينا بكل إرادتنا وقناعتنا بمعزل عن العمل اللي قمنا فيه، لكن كنا نقاتل على أرضنا ومن أجل تحرير أرضنا وتحرير أهلنا وشعبنا. اعتقلنا، مورست علينا كل أساليب التعذيب داخل السجون الإسرائيلية. كان هذا يعني لا يثنينا ولا يحزننا ولا يتعبنا. اتهمنا بالإرهاب، ما كان عندنا مشكلة، كنا نعتبر طالما أنت على حق فالإرهاب، يعني كنا نقول نحن إرهابيون ضد الظلم ومتطرفون من أجل الحق. في هذا المعتقل كان هناك هدفين. بالعنوان الأول أن الاعتقال هو للمقاتلين أو للجنود الذين يقعون في الأسر، لكن في المنطقة التي كانت تسمى الشريط الحدودي أو المنطقة الأمنية المنطقة العازلة التي أنشأتها إسرائيل، كانت نسبة المعتقلين الكبرى داخل هذه السجون هم مدنيون، طلاب، عمال، مزارعون، كانت تهمتهم الوحيدة أنهم رفضوا أن يسيروا بالمشروع الإسرائيلي. وكان هذا هو الظلم الأكبر الذي يمارس على الناس في هذه المنطقة، بغياب كل أنظمة العدالة التي تنادي بالعدالة وبالحرية، كانت غائبة تماما. بالمقابل إذا افترضنا أن كان للبنانيين الحق في الدفاع عن أرضهم، وأيا تكن النتائج إن كانت شهادة أو أسر، فبالنهاية هذا مشروع وطني كبير كنا سويا نسير فيه. بالمقابل لنفترض المثل الآخر، أن في لبنان مثلا الآن يحكى عن مجموعات تقوم بتسليح أو بضرب النظام السوري الذي نعتبره نظاما ممانعا، وبالمقابل كل هذه الأنظمة العالمية التي سعت إلى تدمير العراق وأفغانستان وغيره تحت عناوين الأنظمة الظالمة وأسلحة الدمار الشامل، هو نفس العنوان ينطبق على النظام السوري. لكن هذه المجموعات هل هي مجموعات تسعى للحرية وللعدالة؟ هل هي تصنف إرهابية كونها تقوم بعمل ضد دولة أخرى؟ بالمقابل نحن قاتلنا على أرضنا واستشهدنا في أرضنا وسجننا في أرضنا، لكن لم نسعى إلى تغيير الأنظمة في إسرائيل. شكرا.
Well, thanks for that, and I salute your experience, and bitter indeed it must have been. And I visited Khayyam prison, and I saw the conditions in which the Israeli occupier was holding so many, not only resistance fighters, but also, as you say, students and farmers and other civilians who just happened to be in the area of operations. So I salute your experience and respect it fully. Of course, the Israeli state, the Zionist state, the biggest rogue state in the world, the biggest international lawbreaker in the world, cannot be used by us as our moral standard. We can't say that we will do as they did. We have higher standards than that. Or we end like, you know, Genghis Khan invaded Iran and he killed, I don't know, I think he killed 20% of the entire population. Sometimes he went into villages and simply destroyed every human being within it. He was militarily successful for a time, but he is damned in history, and surely in the other life, in the judgment day, damned also. I'm going to develop some of the points that you raised very powerfully in your contribution, but I have to take just another quick break. Welcome back to Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen TV here in Beirut, talking about prisoners, exchanges, hostage-taking, and all of that moral maze. We have been struggling to find a definition for terrorism, which is, of course, the frame, the paradigm in which this is ordinarily discussed, at least in Western capitals and in Western media. And I was talking before the break to a freedom fighter who was a political prisoner in Lebanon, who was tortured by the Israeli occupiers of Lebanon. He made the point, caught my ear, that they were accused of terrorism. They accepted that. Well, of course, by definition, a person in his own country resisting the violent occupation by another country cannot, by definition, be described as a terrorist. This is a question which often comes up in my own life in the United Kingdom. The morning after, indeed just 3 hours after, I was re-elected back to Parliament, my 6th election, just a couple of months ago, the BBC, the Bush and Blair Corporation, sent someone all the way from London to ask me this question. Not, how did you win this amazing victory? No, it was, do you condemn the terrorist attacks on British forces in occupied Afghanistan? She didn't say occupied, she just said on the mission, because they call it a mission now, not a war, on the mission in Afghanistan. And she was astonished, and so was half the BBC, apparently. at my answer, which was, no, I will not condemn it. It's a ludicrous idea. If you invade and occupy someone else's country, they're going to fight you back. That's their legal right. It's their moral obligation, I would argue. And moreover, if anyone had succeeded in invading and occupying my own country, every decent, self-respecting person would have resisted the foreign occupier. As, of course, there would have been some bankers in the City of London who would have rushed out to offer Hitler some financial services. There would have been some members of the royal family ready to be stooge kings and queens under Hitler. But every decent person would have resisted Nazi occupation of my country. And the Nazis would have called them terrorists, but that would not have made them terrorists. So a person or a group of persons cannot be described as terrorists. Terrorism is a tactic, and the tactic can be identified, can be defined, and I believe should be condemned. But to call a group of people terrorists because they're resisting foreign occupation of their country, as Israel called you, is clearly absurd. It's a distortion, a contortion, a perversion of the English language to use it in such a way. Yes, sir, you wanted to come back on an additional point. Go ahead.
بنفس إطار إمتى نفصل بين مقاومة أو عمل ثوري وعمل إرهابي. في حالة بلبنان معروفة بالمخفيين قسرا في السجون السورية، وهي حالة مرتبطة يرميها البعض على السوريين، إنما هي حالة مرتبطة أصلا بناس مختطفين أو مأسورين على الأراضي اللبنانية من قبل ميليشيات لبنانية، وهي تصرفت فيهم أو صفتهم أو بعضهم عندها أو هي يمكن أعطتهم للسوريين. كيف تصنفون هذه الحالة؟
Every one of us has an obligation to act according to moral principle. And the handing over of people who are in your hands, who are helpless in your hands, to a fate perhaps worse than death, is immoral. It doesn't matter who's doing it or for what purpose. So I oppose it. But I don't think that it influences this debate except in this regard, that this double standard that we've been talking about. For example, on the same day as the Colorado massacre in the United States, when 12 civilians were shot dead by a terrorist, although they didn't call him that because he wasn't a Muslim, in a cinema, dressed as Batman or the Joker, on the same day, Iraqi officials and Al Jazeera, a fanatically pro-Syrian rebel television outfit, reported, small, that a colonel in the Syrian army had his arms and legs cut off whilst he was still alive, in full view of everyone, including the Iraqi officials on the border, and then all 22 of his soldiers were summarily executed, shot dead in cold blood. This is terrorism, no? But we have never heard it in the West. The only person who has ever talked about it in Britain is me. And they quickly changed the subject because they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Terrorism's definitely in the eye of the beholder. They don't talk about that because the terrorists who committed that indecent, obscene act of murder and mutilation are paid by us. They're our agents. We are paying for this kind of crime that took place on the Syrian-Iraqi border. Or this Berri clan who were executed in cold blood, I think in Aleppo, but certainly in Syria over the last couple of weeks. This is terrorism. Killing of people in cold blood is terrorism. Anybody who is killed or harmed for political purposes is the victim of a terrorist act, in my opinion. Yes, sir.
شاد شيء منظمة الشباب التقدمي. نظرة الغرب في بعض الأحيان تنظر إلى هذه التنظيمات بأنها إرهابية أو تسيسها أو تغير المحور. أريد أن أسألك كونك غربي ومطلعا على شرق، لا يخافون في الغرب من تلك الثورات التي تحدث اليوم؟ ما بيعملوا حساب لهذه الأشياء؟ إنه صحيح سألوا مرة صانع لعبة كبيرة، سألوا شخص تخسر بهاللعبة وأنت صنعها، قال له لا، لكن مع الأيام أثبت هذا الرجل الآخر والفريق الآخر بعد ما تمرس بهذه اللعبة أن يتغلب على صانع اللعبة. لم يخاف الغرب من أن يتغلبون عليها اليوم؟ شكرا.
Well, I think that the West is in favor of some revolutions and against others. They were in favor of the Libyan revolution, even though Gaddafi surrendered to them a long time before, even though he gave them everything that they wanted. He allowed them to come in and buy his country. He gave the names and addresses and all the details of all the revolutionaries that he had ever helped. He became the kissing friend of Tony Blair. He wheeled and dealed with all the people who later collaborated in his overthrow and his torture and his brutal murder by people who were shouting the name of God as they sodomized him with a metal bar and murdered him in cold blood. As if God wants such actions to be conducted in his name. So, I repeat myself, a group, an army of irregulars cannot be described routinely by definition as terrorists, though they may from time to time commit terrorist acts. The Libyan revolution were not terrorists, but they definitely committed terrorist acts. They hanged black people from trees. They murdered Gaddafi and his children in cold blood when they were their captives. They ethnically cleansed whole villages and towns because they didn't like the tribe or the ethnicity of the people in those areas. These are terrorist acts. But the Libyan revolution was a legitimate revolution. But the West supported that revolution so that they could shape it and capture it. And you and I have crossed swords before on this subject. And I advise you again, as I advised you then, be careful, because this program doesn't go out this evening. And things might be different in 1 week or 2 weeks from now. There was an interesting exchange between our founder, Ghassan bin Jiddo, and a Syrian minister recently, who objected to Ghassan and al-Mayadeen using the terminology or the phraseology, Free Syrian Army. They are terrorists, the Syrian minister said. And Ghassan said, look, first of all, we are journalists. We don't take orders from governments or politicians. You are confusing us with some other stations. And secondly, he said, you call them terrorists, they call themselves the Free Syrian Army. We have to report what it is that they call themselves. It doesn't mean that they are free. As a matter of fact, you know my views, I don't think they're free at all. I think they already belong to somebody else. They're already in somebody else's pocket. It doesn't even necessarily mean that they're all Syrian. There are thousands of Libyan jihadists fighting now in Syria. And it doesn't mean that they're an army. They certainly don't act like an army, so far as I can see. But that's what they call themselves, the Free Syrian Army. And nothing is gained by attempting to put in a box called terrorist a group of people in order to avoid dealing with them. The British tried this for many years. In Ireland, for example, where I'll be speaking in just a couple of days' time, in the north of Ireland, British occupied territory. For decades, the British fought against the Irish people under occupation, and described those who were defending them and fighting for them as terrorists. But in the end, you know, Britain had to deal with the people they were calling terrorists, because you can't bring a war to an end without talking to the people with whom you're in that war. And that's what I say should happen in Syria also. Yes, sir.
شكرا. لافي المصري أسير محرر من السجون الإسرائيلية، اعتقلت لمدة 10 سنوات، 6 سنين مقعد في السجن. اعتقلت أنا كوني كنت أشتغل ضمن المقاومة الإسلامية بهذا العمل المقاوم، لكن السؤال لماذا زوجتي وبنات عمي 2 وصهري وولاد عمي 3 كونوا كمان جابوهم للتحقيق، كوني أنا بس عم أشتغل ضمن المقاومة بالخط هذا. هناك راح أتطرق لموضوع، بما أنه في كلمة حرة، أتساءل. طبعا الإخوان معاناتنا داخل السجون في إخواننا بيحكوها وكثار إن شاء الله، أنا مش هتطرق للمعاناة كلها بشكل عام، إنما أتساءل وأوجه سؤالي إلى كل الدول الغربية والدول العربية التي تعمل كرمال عيون إسرائيل. هذه الدولة الصهيونية الزائلة البائدة، الدولة الوهمية التي كان هدفها الأساسي، وهي طبعا بعنصريتها بيقولوا الصهاينة إنه نحن الله سبحانه وتعالى، وإن اليهود بشكل عام بيقولوا إنه الله خلقنا نحن كبشر، أما باقي الناس خلقت من نطفة حصان، ولكن جعل البشر، جعلنا نحن بالصورة اللي نحن فيها حتى يكون عند كل إسرائيلي 500 إنسان خدم. هذه بعائدتهم، نحن درسنا عن عائدتهم. بالمقابل الثاني كان هدف اللوب الصهيوني احتلال العالم. أول دولة الاتحاد السوفيتي قبل الانهيار الاتحاد السوفيتي، والثاني دولة بريطانيا، والثالث دولة نيويورك، أمريكا، الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، وتكون العاصمة تبعها نيويورك. العاصمة تبع اللوب الصهيوني ينطلقوا من خلال من هونيك بهذا العمل. بنلاحظ أنه كل مشروع صهيوني تقدم ساعدوا الغرب أو العرب الموالين للصهاينة، ساعدوهم بهذا العمل، دفعوا الثمن. هن بريطانيا جابت اليهود على فلسطين، أنشأت الدولة الصهيونية، دفع الثمن البريطانيين بأحد الفنادق الذي دمروه على الجنود البريطانيين، وطردوا البريطانيين مش بطريقة انسحاب، طريقة طرد. ومنلاحظ كذلك الأمر في جنود أجانب، إن كان ألمان أو اليوم اللي عم بيموتوا بأفغانستان أو بالباكستان أو بالعراق أو غيره من الجنود الغربيين وغيره، مش هذا بثمن المشروع الإسرائيلي؟ أو عم يموتوا بثمن المشروع الإسرائيلي. وهذه الصهاينة عم يوهموا العالم إنه نحن الشعب الحر ونحن الشعب المتعلم ونحن الشعب الفهم. لا بالعكس، هذه دولة تبنى على العنصرية بهالشكل هذا أكيد زائلة وبائدة. ليش الشعب الغربي بيخاف منها؟ ليش الشعب بيتعامل معهم كدولة لازم تكون عايشة هي، مع العلم إنه هن عم يدفعوا الثمن، وبالمقابل آخر شيء إذا بقيت إسرائيل فهن بيكونوا انتهوا. فلا، إرادة الشعب الحر هي اللي ستزيل إسرائيل وتبيد إسرائيل. فبتمنى عبر الكلمة الحرة والقناة الحرة وكونك إنسان حر إنه يوصل كلامنا، رسالتنا توصل للشعب العالمي العربي والغربي الحر. وشكرا لكم.
Thank you. I'm going to respond to that very powerful contribution right after this. Welcome back to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen TV. This is where we believe every word has the right to be free. But remember, all these free words I'm speaking are my responsibility alone. So if there's any mistakes in it, blame me rather than Al Mayadeen. I don't want to put my employer in any further difficulty. Or myself necessarily, but I have to respond to the gentleman from the Islamic resistance here in Lebanon, himself 10 years a prisoner in the Israeli dungeons. He didn't say so, but I'm pretty sure mistreated, even tortured, as so many of Israel's prisoners routinely are. And this is a matter of fact, testified to by many jurists abroad and even in Israel. It's no longer a matter of contention that Israel breaks every international law, every convention, every rule of war and every rule of the treatment of prisoners. But I wanted to respond to one point only in the powerful contribution that he made in the interest of getting more people into the debate. And it was this, and it's very important. The vast majority of people, ordinary people in Britain, in America, and in all the countries that support these crimes committed by Israel, gain nothing at all from this poisonous relationship between this rogue state, Israel, and its Western patrons, armorers, financiers, diplomatic schmoozers. The vast majority of people, in fact, in the United States, have everything to lose by this grotesque, unequal relationship, where everything is bent in the United States towards the interests of a country of 7 million people, namely Israel, while spitting in the face of 350 million Arabs and 2 billion Muslims around the world. And Mr. Bush and Mr. Blair made our two countries two of the 3 most hated countries on the earth. Israel, America, Britain, the 3 most hated countries on the earth, because we have deliberately gone out of our way to support every crime that Israel commits. We have invaded and occupied one Muslim country after another, and we have performed the wonders of Abu Ghraib prison and Bagram air base and all the other torture charnel houses that these so-called leaders of the free world, so-called democracies, have been implicated in. The vast majority of people, therefore, objectively have no interest, objective interest, in this relationship. And it's the task of all of us to work to try to persuade them of that. All I say to the Americans, for example, on my weekly American radio show, is I'm not asking for an American government that will act in the interests of the Palestinian people. I'm not asking for an American government that will act in the interests of the Arabs. I'm asking for an American government that will act in the interests of the Americans, the American people, not the Israeli people, because the interests of the American people are not the same. In fact, are diametrically opposite in every economic, strategic, security, and other regard. Now, time for a lady contribution. Yes, madam?
أنا فلسطينية يابانية. أنا إعلامية، ولكن أيضا أتي من عائلة معروفة لنقول بالخطف لاسترجاع الأسرى، اللي هي الجيش الأحمر الياباني. الوالدة هي المؤسسة للجيش الأحمر الياباني. أنا سؤالي هون، مثلا الجيش الأحمر الياباني والمؤسسات والمنظمات الفلسطينية التحررية بالسبعينات قامت بعمليات كثيرة للاختطاف وأخذ الأسرى يعني بدالهم. ولكن نعرف نحن تاريخيا أنه الأسرى لم يؤذوا، لم يقتلوا، عادة كانوا يعني يكون في عملية تبادل في النهاية. السؤال أو بالأحرى النقطة اللي حابة أنا أقوله هون هو إنه لما بيكون الفاعل يعني الخاطف لنفترض هو منظمات غير نظامية، جيش غير نظامي، يعتبروا إرهابيين أو يعتبر هذه العملية عملية خطف. ولكن في نقطة كتير مهمة نحن مش عم نحكي عنها هون، هي الاعتقال الإداري. الاعتقال الإداري هو نوع من الخطف من قبل النظام. فكيف نحن لازم يعني نتطرق له، وكيف نحن لازم نبرز هذا الخطف من قبل النظام للأشخاص الذين يكونوا يعني لهم دور سياسي مناهض لنفترض الحكومات أو الاحتلال اللي هن موجودين فيه.
Well, that was a surprising and unexpected contribution, and thank you for making it, for your forthrightness and courage in making it. I'm not going to comment on the activities of the Japanese Red Army. I'm not qualified to do so. I have no doubt of the sincerity of their solidarity with the Palestinian people. I equally have no doubt that they committed terrorist acts by the definition of terrorism that I have adumbrated here this evening. Of course, I don't know your mother. I'm not addressing her in that regard, but I just must say that. The question of the state's role in asymmetric conflicts against irregular forces is age-old. The British invented concentration camps, for example, long before Hitler. I think before Hitler was born. Certainly Hitler was a tiny child when the British invented concentration camps. They did so in South Africa to imprison the families of the Boer farmers, and they killed tens of thousands of them in these camps, not by gas chambers, but by starvation and typhus and all the other diseases that inevitably flowed from concentrating people in these concentration camps. And there's no doubt that however elaborate the state form, when it's challenged, it quickly peels away all the elaboration and is revealed, you'll recognize the reference, as an armed body of men. The state, in the end, is an armed body of men. It constructs much paraphernalia to disguise that essential truth, but in the end, the state, that's why I always almost laugh. I have to laugh or I cry when I hear people say that, for example, the Syrian regime or the former Iraqi regime will fight to the death and kill any number in order to preserve their regime. Every regime will fight to the death to preserve its regime. It's its reason for being. And there's no doubt that they are ready to cancel liberty in the name of security. But as the American thinker and constitutionalist Benjamin Franklin put it, those who will sacrifice liberty for security in the end will enjoy neither liberty nor security. And that's exactly what's happening in Western countries now. And I told you I'm going in a couple of days to the north of Ireland. Tens of thousands, scores of thousands of Irish people were placed effectively in concentration camps. They called it internment, imprisonment without trial, which became big universities, by the way, revolutionary universities. And all of the Irish revolutionaries that went on to fight the British got their education in Marxism, in guerrilla warfare, and all the other things that they learned them there in the British prisoner camps. So there's no doubt that administrative detention, detention without trial, concentration camps, all of these are part of the terrorist potential of states. And you are right to bring us back to that, because we want to look at both sides of this coin. But I want also to insist that it is an obligation on revolutionary people to behave in a moral way. Otherwise, the revolution means nothing and will be corrupted by sinful acts to the point where it will lose its moral compass. And that has happened. It did happen in Iraq. It is happening now in Syria, where people who are conducting themselves in the form of revolution, the content of their revolution is so bankrupted morally. For example, the murder of people because of their religion. What's that you're wearing? Is it a cross? Cut your throat. Are you a Sunni or a Shiite? Cut your throat. This kind of behavior leaves bankrupt the moral standing of the revolutionary organization, and it loses its legitimacy in calling itself a revolutionary organization in the first place. And that's even more, you may not agree with me, that's even more important where the fighters say that they are fighting in the name of God. They fight in the name of God. They shout the name of God every time they fire, Allahu Akbar, bang, even though this bang is going to blow some innocent person's head apart. I'm sure that God doesn't accept this. Yes, sir.
أحمد صبري فلسطيني من الكابري قضاء عكا. أنا اعتقلت لمدة 5 سنين بالسجون الإسرائيلية. صحيح إحنا كنا أسرى يعني بين الحديد أو بين الأسلاك، بس كنا أكثر حرية من أنظمة عربية متخاذلة. صحيح كنا مطوقين بجنود العدو، بدبابات العدو، بحقد العدو، بس هن كانوا محاطين بعارهم وذلهم. لن نتسول حريتنا من أحد منهم. كان لنا ثقة بمنظمة التحرير وخاصة الشهيد القائد ياسر عرفات، وعمل على تحرير اللي صارت عملية التبادل بسنة 83. وبالنسبة للمقاومة الوطنية والإسلامية بلبنان، لولا وجود المقاومة الوطنية والإسلامية بلبنان ولا أسير كان بيطلع. إحنا إلنا ثقة بالمقاومة الفلسطينية والمقاومة الوطنية والإسلامية لتحرير كافة الأسرى والمعتقلين بالسجون الإسرائيلية، وإلنا ثقة بالمقاومة العراقية لتحرير كافة أسراها بالسجون الأمريكية. والسلام عليكم.
Thank you very much, sir. And again, I honor your own experience, and I'm glad that you shared it with us here this evening. Of course, it is a duty, wajib, so an obligation on any revolutionary to try to free his comrades from the enemy's prisons. And I think that capturing the enemy's soldiers or personnel, not necessarily frontline soldiers, but people who are supporting the occupation, people who are indispensable in its operation, is a legitimate revolutionary tactic. I believe that. It's a controversial thing for a British parliamentarian to say, but I'm saying it because I believe it. But they also have an obligation to treat the prisoner humanely. And they also have an obligation not to kill the prisoner. This is the point that I'm making repeatedly, perhaps, because I do think that not everything goes in revolution. We can't say because we are the revolutionaries, anything goes. In fact, because we are the revolutionaries, we have more restrictions because we are fighting for an ethical and moral purpose. And we have to behave in an ethical and moral way. I think we've had three prisoners who suffered in these prisons. And we are looking this evening at the issue of whether or not it is ethical to take prisoners, to try to free other prisoners, whether these prisoner swaps, and I don't know if any of you were actually freed in prisoner swaps, but many of my best friends actually were so freed in these prisoner swaps, and if they had not been, I would never have seen them again. More importantly, their families would never have seen them again, and their whole lives would have been wasted in the prisons of Israel, and one or two other places around the world also. So I'm not here arguing that revolutionaries are forbidden to conduct such kind of operations. They are. But they have an obligation in so conducting themselves militarily and politically. And this is for the success of the revolution. I mean, one of the reasons why the communist government in Nepal was able to overthrow the Nepalese monarchy and become the power in Nepal was because every part of the territory that they liberated, they governed better than the regime that they had driven out. They were more just, they were less corrupt, they behaved towards the people in a morally superior way. So the people, seeing their territory liberated by this Red Army of fighters, began to say, actually, we support these people because they are better than the others. who are ruling us. And this is true in many other parts of the world. So the revolutionaries have to behave in a moral way. And we're discussing that here on Kalima Horra this evening, where every word has a right to be free, including the words of my studio audience and, of course, you, the audience throughout the world. I'll be back with the last segment of this edition of Kalima Horra just after this. Welcome back to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen TV, and to our studio audience here in Beirut. We're talking about the moral maze which envelops or encircles this debate, and it's not easy to find a clear path through it, but we're trying our best. Terrorism arose in this region. The first terrorists were the group called the Hashashin, from which the word in English assassin comes from. In the mountains of Iraq and Iran, this group arose. It's said that they liked to smoke hash and therefore were oblivious to the consequences of their action, and they specialized in spectacular, daring, violent action, whose purpose was to terrorize the people against whom they were fighting. And there are still some terrorists in this region. So who are the terrorists? Who are the big terrorists? Who are the small terrorists? What are terrorists? What is terrorism? That's what's occupying us this evening. Yes, the gentleman at the back of the room.
أنا مراد عياش. في عندي بس مداخلة سريعة بالنسبة للمعادلة اللي قدرت المقاومة سنة 2006 بلبنان فرضها، واللي هي اسم سمير الأنطار. كان العالم كله بيعرف اسم سمير الأنطار. بعتقد هيدي المعركة النوعية يلي قدرت المقاومة الإسلامية بلبنان تفرضها، معركة قدرت تهزم جيش كلاسيكي ومؤسسات وراء. العالم كله كان يعرف اسم سمير الأنطار وما كان يعرف اسم الجنديان الذين خطفتهم المقاومة. في سؤال تاني، هناك تعتيم إعلامي على أسير اسمه يحيى سكاف. أين نحن من معركة تحرير يحيى سكاف؟ شكرا.
Well, I have no doubt that there are other political prisoners that the Lebanese national resistance is determined upon freeing from unjust incarceration. And if there's one group of people in the entire world upon whom you can depend on meaning what they say and saying what they mean and doing what they say, it has to be the Lebanese national resistance. I know that Israel listens carefully to what the Lebanese national resistance say, because they know that that resistance does what it says. Doesn't just say, it does. And it's vital for the Lebanese not to lose sight of the fact, and not to lose their pride in the fact that the Lebanese national resistance, an irregular fighting force, is the only Arab army ever to defeat Israel in the field of battle. And Israel will not come back very easily or quickly for another lesson like the one they learned in 2006. So I don't know this prisoner to whom you refer, but if Israel is holding him, and I know that you're watching this, Mr. Israel, do yourselves a favor and set him free. Let's take another contribution from the middle row there. Yes, sir.
السلام عليكم مستر
عليكم
جالوي.
السلام.
عندما يقاوم الفرنسي، الإنسان الفرنسي عندما يتصدى للاحتلال النازي يكون مقاوما، ولكن عندما نقاوم الاحتلال الإسرائيلي نصبح إرهابيين. هناك مظلومية كبيرة بحقنا. لا أرضى أنا كمقاوم بقيت في المعتقل 5 سنوات أن أجتمع مع إرهابي يقوم بتفجير نفسه في مسجد أو في عرس أو في أي حفل كان، يقتل أطفالا ونساء. إضافة لذلك، إذا نحن كنا إرهابيين، من هو الذي يتعرض منا للإرهاب؟ من هو الذي أرهبناه؟ هل هو إنسان عادي؟ هل هو صحفي؟ هل هو إنسان في بيته؟ هل هو منظم إنسانية أو هو محتال؟ شكرا لك.
a very powerful point, and it's one that I've tried to make every day almost since 9/11, that the deaths of the American citizens destroyed on 9/11, destroyed by red-hot, razor-sharp steel, sheets of flying glass, burning flames, horrific deaths. The woman who dies under the bombardment of Iraq in shock and awe, or in the US-UK invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, does not die any less terrible a death than this. It's very important for people to treat each person's blood as equal and their life and their liberty as equal. It's very important to walk a mile in the other person's shoes, because if you cannot feel empathy. Without empathy, you're no longer a human being. I once said, after a radio broadcast between Mrs. Bush and Mrs. Blair, as they asked us all to remember the heartbreaking messages left on the answering machines of the telephones of the families of the women who were hurtling to their deaths on those airplanes on 9/11. Heartbreaking messages. But I said to Mrs. Blair, and by extension to Mrs. Bush, just because Afghan women don't have answering machines, they don't have mobile telephones, they can't leave messages for their loved ones, it doesn't make their deaths any less obscene than the deaths of those American women on 9/11. It's the fact that Western audiences cannot see this that is the fundamental problem that we have in the world today, where some people can be routinely killed and disposed of without their names even being sought, never mind known, around the world, whilst the fixation on our own fallen, our own dead in Western countries, or in Israel, which is by extension a Western country, is apparently endless. So thanks for that contribution. Now, who's next with the microphone? Yes, sir.
محمد مواس الشباب القومي العربي. كيف ترون قضية الأسرى في السجون الفرنسية جورج عبد الله اللبناني والفنزويلي العربي إلتش راميريز سانشيز الذي خطف من السودان إرضاء للصهيونية العالمية؟ وهل ترون في الاحتجاجات السلمية حلا لقضيتهم، أم أن المقاومة المسلحة فرضت معادلة الأسير مقابل الأسير حتى مع الفرنسيين؟
Well, of course, everybody would prefer if we could have peaceful resistance and persuasion to persuade Israel to leave Palestine, for example, or leave those parts of Lebanon that they currently occupy. But my experience is that that's not likely to happen. People who are subject to brutal occupation of their country, of their land, or are driven from their land, in the case of the Palestinian people, have every right to take up arms to seek to recover their land. They have every right. That doesn't mean the armed struggle will always be the most effective tactic. And certainly it's abundantly clear the armed struggle by itself cannot liberate Palestine, cannot drive the British and American occupiers out of Afghanistan. I was for many, many years, as might have become apparent in the course of this evening, closely identified with the African National Congress fighting apartheid in South Africa. I was one of the few progressive people who was moving around underground from outside of the country, moving around underground inside apartheid South Africa as an agent of the African National Congress, sent there by the ANC. And by the way, this is important, you should know this, all of the safe houses, all of the transportation, all of the lunches and all of the dinners that I ate whilst underground in South Africa were provided by South African Jews, South African Jewish members of the African National Congress. So Jews don't have to be with apartheid. In South Africa, they were not with apartheid. And we appeal all the time to Jews around the world. You don't have to be with apartheid. You can be with those who are fighting against apartheid. And in the course of that struggle, I came to love the slogan of the ANC and the slogan of their armed wing, Umkhonto and Sizwe, MK. Their slogan was, between the hammer of armed struggle and the anvil, Sindan, I think in Arabic, the anvil, Sindan, between the hammer of armed struggle and the anvil of mass popular resistance, without weapons, mass popular resistance, between that hammer and this anvil, apartheid will be broken. And it was. And it's clear enough to me, the armed struggle is not going to liberate Palestine on its own. It will have a part to play, but we have to pay much more attention to making that anvil. Let me try to squeeze in one more question. Anyone? Yes, please, sir.
نبيل حلاق ناشط سياسي. بداية يعني في بداية الحديث اللي يعني تحدث به أستاذ جورج، موضوع خطف، يعني عمليا خطف أشخاص بمدنيين، ومن ثم أي كذلك الأمر أنه عمليا يعني عملية أسر يعني جنود أو عناصر لاستبدالهم بأسرى أو مسجونين. بداية أنا من تجربتنا الشخصية، يعني من تجربتي الشخصية في إطار أسطول الحرية، طبعا نحن تعرضنا للحصار في عرض البحر أو في أعالي البحار أو في المياه الدولية من قبل البحرية الإسرائيلية، وكنا محاصرين وأسرى في تلك يعني في تلك اللحظات، ومن ثم تم الاعتداء المباشر علينا من خلال قرصنة مسلحة في المياه الدولية. طبعا الناس الذين كانوا مشاركين والناشطين والذين هم كانوا يعني ينتسبون إلى 45 دولة وإلى الأديان الثلاثة أيضا، ليسوا محصورين بإطار أو لون أو جهة أو يعني أو منطقة محددة من العالم، وكلهم طبعا كان هدفهم دعم القضية الفلسطينية وكسر الحصار عن غزة. تعرض أولئك الناشطين وأنا منهم إلى الهجوم والاعتداء المباشر بالسلاح الحي بالذخيرة الحية، واضطررنا أن نأسر جنود إسرائيليين أثناء المواجهة، وهذا الأمر لم يأخذه الإعلام، يعني لم يأخذ حيز في الإعلام، لا نعلم لماذا، ولكن اضطررنا أن نأسر الجنود الإسرائيليين بعد استشهاد 5 شهيد ناشط كان من بيننا. طبعا عدد الشهداء هم 8 و45 جريح، ولكن بعد استشهاد ال5 اضطررنا وبمباركة المطران إلاريون كبوجي مفتي القدس الذي طبعا يحييكم جميعا، وهو الذي كان في الأسر أيضا وكما تعلمون طبعا سيرته، اضطررنا أن نقوم بهذا العمل، وكان لي الشرف أن أشارك في أسر الجند الثالث. عمليا كان هذا الأسر هو الضمان لنا بإيقاف مسلسل القتل المباشر المتعمد الذي كان يعتمده الجندي الإسرائيلي أثناء الهجوم علينا، وهذا نجح في تخفيف وفي وقف إطلاق النار المباشر علينا، ومن ثم طبعا المبادلة في اتجاه أن نخلي الجرحى، لأنه كان لدينا 45 جريح واثنين منهم استشهدا نصفا، يعني نصفوا حتى الموت.
Well, again, I am in awe of the personal experience of so many of our audience this evening. And I salute you, sir, for the heroism and the courage that you and your fellow sailors on board the Mavi Marmara showed. I started out talking about the act of high piracy on the high seas by the so-called self-proclaimed emperors of the world. And we have ended the discussion talking about a modern-day act of piracy or terrorism by the State of Israel, the world's biggest terrorist state. I hope you've enjoyed Kalima Horra. I hope you found every word had the right to be free, and if you have a different point of view, of course, then please let me know. God willing, I'll be back for the next edition of Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen TV. Until then, good night.